Last Bastion was born from a lot of things, my frustration and failures with past creations being one. But more than anything, it was born from the awe-inspiring architecture, grandiose scale, and interconnectivity I experienced while first playing through the Dark Souls series. I wanted to capture everything about the level design, all wrapped up in a microcosm. This included epic towers with spiraling steps, overgrown castle walls, dramatic cathedrals, windy paths, intimidating vertical scale, gloomy graveyards, and light rays blooming through every window and seam. Because maps are only as deep as they are balanced, all of these set pieces would have to translate into practical play spaces just as much as they serve to provide an overarching narrative. Having cool locations to fight in and around would be pointless if players aren't inclined to be there in the first place. In much the same way that each quadrant in a game of chess provides positives and negatives according to the context of a match, I wanted to try and provide that same kind of depth into my map by maximizing the amount of different variables that can be packed into each square footage of the map. In summary, the map had to be just as deep and balanced as it was beautiful. All of these aspirations swelled within me as I began laying down the foundations of my map in January of 2017. There are several different ways you can go about building a map. You can first lay out the footprint and sightline connections that make up the logic of the map, with art being implemented last, as was the case with my map tribunal. Or you could start with the art, focusing first and foremost on the narrative side of the experience, balancing the various set pieces as you go to make sure they work together as a practical play space. While certain methods are arguably more efficient than others, gray areas included, these are all just a means to an end, and you should feel free to try different approaches, because at the end of the day, all that matters is the results. In the case of Last Bastion, I bounced back and forth between the art and logic before I finally found a good rhythm to bring it full circle. For example, the first segment of the map that took shape was completely the result of my artistic drive, the signature tower and its surrounding connections. This was also a great segment to build around from a practical standpoint, with the potential to create dramatic and challenging interactions as a result of the verticality and connectivity. The lowest floor would be a one-way drop, perfect for placing incentives that could challenge somebody's decision-making skills. The spiral step connection between mid-choke point and the higher choke point had the potential to provide organic lines of sight when aiming in or out of the tower. Already, the set piece had established an identity that inspired much of what would come after. While this was a good start, I needed a more concrete direction to guide my hand as I continued to develop the layout. My mind wandered to several different map shapes. These can be used to create a loose framework that you can build the rest of your map around. While there are many tried and true shapes that we've seen no shortage of over the years in FPS Arena, I decided to continue developing a shape I pioneered at the beginning of Halo 5 that hasn't seen as much exploration. I call it the double L. If I could reduce this shape to its most fundamental appeal, it would be the linearity coupled with the potential for fast-changing relationships between the two lanes. Because both lanes are closely adjacent to one another, a team of two will always be presented with the choice to double up on one lane or split up and go for a coordinated flank. If these lanes were any further apart, they would lose that quickly changing relationship between the two. As for the decision to bend the shape at a 90-degree angle, this was done to segment the lines of sight on the outer lanes, establishing neutral zones which would offer no particular advantage or disadvantage. Instead, these zones would provide players a balance between defensibility and opportunity. Settling on the shape established a floor plan, but there still isn't a whole lot going on right now. Next, height variations and pieces of cover were added to round off the engagements in between positions of significance. This was done to encourage movement, rewarding players who successfully advance, securing a foothold on the enemy. The added cover was intentionally minimalistic, only going as far as to provide a brief cooldown in between fights, or an opportunity to stall while your teammate swings around for a flank. The outer connector being the fastest route in between both neutral positions, I decided should continue to be the most vulnerable. Should players recklessly beeline to their targets, they can be caught defenseless for both neutrals and the inner lane. Next, I started to mold the shape to tighten up some of the sight lines leading into blue neutral, while simultaneously rounding off the outer connector, overall creating more organic interactions in between both neutrals. This also opened up the inner lane even further, which set the stage for what would eventually become an atrium. I decided the atrium should contrast the very straightforward options already present in between both neutrals. I wanted to make sure that this side of the map would challenge players to think more carefully about where to go by featuring much more opportunities to one-up the enemy team, at the cost of being more punishing upon failure. How I decided to manifest this was threefold. First, I created a bridge connecting both neutrals with a powerful, but also vulnerable path. This elevated position could be used to overpower enemy targets directly below, or for some very oppressive advances on either neutral position. This bridge would become accessible from both neutrals, or an exposed ramp leading up from the inner L junction. The bridge offered a more dominant approach to all three neutrals should players become too comfortable sitting back, leaving the atrium unchecked. The tail end of the bridge was tapered off to compensate for the gentle curve away from blue neutral. For all of its uses, the bridge was not without its weaknesses. For example, if players in control of the bridge go for the long-winded flake on blue neutral, there will be opportunities along the way for players here to contest enemy targets on their way across the bridge. First on the base floor, then on the elevated platform, and finally, a stronger counter on these recently added windows overlooking the atrium. As for red neutral, it was important that this side had the stronger counter, seeing as how it was the more defensible of the two neutrals. From here, it's much more difficult to contest targets who have gained control of the bridge. However, when utilizing the spiral steps inside the tower, players here would have a line of sight along the vulnerable side of the bridge. Also, as previously mentioned, this recently added path allows players to somewhat contest the bridge, only with a few vital blind spots. While the tower allows one to see alongside the bridge, there is less opportunity to follow up. On the bridge connector, however, you have more blind spots, but more opportunity to follow up. Both of these options demand some sort of prior commitment and forethought to be most effective. Second, I created a third neutral position that would help pull some of the weight away from this side of the map, creating more triangulated interactions across the atrium. This segment would be elevated just enough to maintain interaction between both neutrals, and, more importantly, because third neutral was positioned behind the bridge, with a line of sight all up and down the vulnerable side, players here can lock down the top of the map by keeping enemy targets from accessing the bridge from either neutral. This third neutral position would also feature a one-way teleporter leading to the tower overlooking red neutral. This was done to balance out all the defensive options red neutral had, from the tower overlooking the bridge to the recently added path overlooking the outer lane connector. As always, it was very important to me to make sure I avoid hard counters on my maps. This option, while it might seem like it was intended as a hard counter, is just as punishable as any other approach when you take into consideration the risk you put yourself in leading up to the telly and coming out of the receiving end. It's better to think of this as a simple one-way connection that creates a rich variety of potential interactions between red and third neutral. Just like the bridge, I wanted to make sure this newly added position was as vulnerable as it is useful. While third neutral does provide enough cover to sit here comfortably for a moment, you won't last long if you allow your opponent to reach the bridge from the innermost ramp. The last major iteration would be a centerpiece support structure, providing cover in the atrium players could dance around while still keeping everything open. But also, because the structure is situated in the middle, this cover was non-biased, allowing players to approach the atrium from different sides of the map with the same neutral piece of cover. This unbiased approach to providing cover creates an emphasis on movement being the player's main means of defense as they bob and weave around the central structure to avoid gunfire. Finally, I added a platform onto the bridge support pillar that connected the three neutral positions with a defensible checkpoint. This was a very implication-heavy addition, a decision I didn't make lightly. The platform being underneath the bridge means players below can neutralize enemy targets' ability to completely overpower them from above. The circular nature of the geometry also means players can hug the pillar and go 360 degrees around to take advantage of several different lines of sight very quickly. Some notable examples being the top of the spiral staircase, and the adjacent windows above blue neutral. If you've been paying attention, you may have noticed a seeming contradiction. This addition seems to undermine the whole reason why I made the support structure unbiased in the first place, by allowing a player in the atrium access to a very biased and powerful piece of cover. Typically, pieces of cover like this that allow you to hug them very closely to manipulate each side can become ripe for exploit. The reason being, players here can move behind cover faster than any one person on the perimeter can keep up with. This is made worse when you consider how, in a 1v1 situation, the only way an enemy target could ever hope to close the gap is to climb up onto the platform, putting them at a disadvantage. Also, consider the lack of a backboard, preventing grenades from being effective. However, seeing as how this is a 2v2 setting, and because this position is located lower center mass between all three neutrals, a coordinated team of two can pick off targets on the pillar from several directions. One more thing I'd like to point out. Players that choose to rotate around the pillar on the outer atrium will be able to keep their field of view open and unrestricted, while players positioned on the pillar have to be much more deliberate about where they choose to place their line of sight. Subtle features like this help balance out what can sometimes seem to be major flaws. Now, convenient as these three major iterations might seem to have taken place, the bridge, third neutral, and the support pillar, this was all for the sake of presentation, and was a lot more messy in practice, I admit. I glossed over a lot of the reasons why I settled on these specific iterations, because sometimes the best way to communicate their significance is to explain how they function in context of one another. So, with the macro layout mostly completed, let's slow things down and take a step back to look at some of the hypothetical gameplay scenarios that could take place after all of these recent additions. Let's say a player wants to flank red neutral and they are approaching from blue. They can ignore the ramp and go for the quickest flank, as was already possible before. This might be the better option if you know the enemy is weak and on the run. Or, they can now choose to climb up the ramp onto the bridge, requiring more travel time, but offering a more dominant position overlooking red neutral. This would be a better long-term option if you are flanking alone and know both enemy targets are still alive and well. Alternatively, players in blue neutral could ignore both of these options in favor of a more long-winded approach, up, over, and onto the bridge, a safer route, ultimately leading to the same place, but with much more travel time. If players are having a difficult time finding their way out onto any one of these positions, the pillar platform is a hop, skip, and a jump away, the safest option, with a good balance of follow-up options once you feel comfortable enough to move out. The last major option to approach red neutral would be to make their way towards third neutral, either above bridge or below. And now, with the teleport in your back pocket, quick access to the bridge, and just enough cover to stall out enemy targets on red neutral, the opportunities to coordinate an attack with your teammate open up to provide several different strategies of approach. Now, let's look at how these additions change the options for players approaching blue neutral from red. While the ramp can be reached faster from red neutral, you can see here that it is exposed to much of blue neutral. Players approaching from red neutral will have to put themselves at a momentary risk in order to get to the bridge quickly. Alternatively, players from red neutral can gain access to the bridge through this newly added position just above red neutral's dance floor. This route can take up to twice as long to finally get to the bridge, but half of that travel time the player can remain uncontested so long as the enemy team neglects to stick their neck out and apply pressure. Once the player does get access to the bridge, they can continue to poke at enemy targets inside, before finally moving in for the kill through blue neutral's metaphorical back door. If players in red neutral want to make less committed advancements out, they can make their way out to the support pillar platform, getting there rather quickly with cover in between. From here, they can buy some time and poke at enemy targets before making their next move, which includes doubling back to any of the previously mentioned options, taking control of third neutral, or simply pushing straight forward, down, towards blue neutral flank, the fastest way to advance, at the cost of being more vulnerable. Keep in mind, All these hypothetical examples were focusing on the changes to the atrium, completely ignoring the outer connector's role, and assuming one very particular instance, where both teams are in their respective starting neutral locations, and only one team is on the offense. While this instance does make up a reoccurring portion of the map's macro engagement, as players move around in an attempt to one-up each other, the context will begin to nuance, and suddenly, the map becomes an ever-changing battleground where each milestone in the match's lifespan demands new thoughts of approach. Consider the following. Red team makes a very ambitious push off spawn through the outer connector to hopefully catch them off guard, while blue team makes their way towards third neutral in anticipation of red team setting up a defensive stance. How then will the battle play out? Do the teams split up? Stick together? What if blue team, upon realizing red team is on their heels, decides to send one of their own through the teleporter into the tower, while the other remains behind? This way, blue team can now bait their opponents into a trap. The amount of different hypothetical combat scenarios that could take place once the match is in motion exceeds whatever amount of time one would be willing to sit here and listen to my voice. What was previously straightforward and generally shallow encounters in between red and blue neutral are made much more complex when taking into consideration all the recent iterations. Before we finally move forward to the art segment of the documentary, I want to emphasize how important it is to avoid one-dimensional iterations. With all of my recent additions to the map, this is a perfect opportunity for a lesson in level design. Maps are just like any other complex system in life. Whenever you add, subtract, or generally change map geometry, make sure to consider all of the possible implications of that change. Even the smallest of changes can make or break the balance of your entire map. For example, while these newly added connections between both neutrals and the bridge do add depth, they also created more problems. Players in either of these positions could simply peek in and out of cover faster than anyone else in the perimeter could keep up with. It's similar to the pillar platform, only because these positions are on the outmost perimeter, it's much more difficult to coordinate a counter. Iterating geometry with only one goal in mind is a recipe for disaster. Always consider the many implications of any change you want to make, and be prepared to revise other segments of your map as the greater whole continues to evolve. The last major changes I made to the macro layout of the map was to disjoint the bridge connectors leading in and out of both neutrals. This would force players to make a committed decision if they wanted to access the bridge, and ensured players would be able to contest these positions, even from far away. The red neutral connector was then inclined to allow players at the bottom to contest enemy targets attempting to take control of the bridge. The blue neutral connector was rounded off to nuance the interactions between third neutral, creating soft checkpoints as players push and pull along the bridge. These changes also reinforce one of the roles third neutral was designed to fill in the first place, by allowing players positioned here to more consistently maintain top bridge control. Even after all the nerfs to both neutral bridge connectors, it was still a balanced option. If the player loses a fight in either of these now very committed positions, all they have to do is retreat back down to their respective neutrals, resetting the fight. All that was left to do before moving on to the art phase of development was the incentives. Traditionally, sprinkling incentives around maps was a clever way for designers to keep their players moving around, a kind of built-in failsafe to fix what would ultimately become players holding down defensive choke points. While I agree this is a better alternative to just letting the degenerative habits of players ruin the fun for everyone, including themselves, I think we can do better. I saved the incentives for last because I wanted to first ensure that my players move around the map due to how valuable each position is, not because they have to resupply ammunition constantly to compete. These incentives should only add on to the overall experience, not be made up of them. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I already had the bottom of the tower reserved in mind for what I had ultimately decided would be a sniper rifle. As soon as the player got their hands on the sniper, they would immediately become a threat, both inside the tower, and even more so when stepping outside into the atrium. This set the stage for epic narrative-driven encounters to take place all up, down, and around the tower. The second major incentive I incorporated into the map would take place at the end of blue neutral, which was extended even further back to create a dead-end choke point. Placing the incentive at the end of blue neutral would create tension as players push and pull along the dance floor. It was also at this moment I realized, by opening up the bridge wall, both of these one-way exits could interact from across the entire map. As I'm sure you could imagine, this had huge implications. Here are some of the smaller adjustments that made their way into the final design. The opening in between the bridge ramps was adjusted to create a line of sight in between the tower one-way exit and blue neutral window. Bars were added to the windows to keep players from falling up immediately after their use, reinforcing the blue neutral windows as very deliberate options, requiring some forward thinking to be most effective. I tweaked some of the geometry halfway up the staircase leading to third neutral, creating a pocket for grenades to more easily be placed, and providing players ascending or descending the stairs some cover. I added another layer of geometry over the walls that protrude just enough to allow players to jump off of them, gaining more leverage on enemy targets during a gunfight. The cover lining the outer wall in front of red neutral was adjusted, providing just enough cover to compete against enemy targets in third neutral. This empowers players who want to make progressive advancements into the atrium, and lines them up to be flanked by the receiving teleporter if they fail to contest their neutral. Geometry was added here to block the line of sight in between the red neutral connector and the bridge. This line of sight would have to be earned by completing the trip all the way up to the top of the connector. And now, with the mentally draining portion of the documentary finally completed, we can all let out a sigh of relief as we move on to the art phase of development, starting first with the lighting. In order to achieve the same blooming effect I fell in love with in Dark Souls 1, I grouped together the entire map, moved it onto a canvas with the most dense volumetric lighting, and then rotated the map to optimize the amount of different seams the light could penetrate. You can see in this example how I utilized the volumetric lighting to help frame the receiving teleporter on top of the tower, further emphasizing how important the teleporter is in the grand scheme of the map. The organic shape of the wall reminded me of Halo 3's Zanzibar. This inspired me to set the map along the coast, only instead of a beach, rocks were incorporated into the map's foundation. This maintained the highly vertical environment I set out to create in the first place. Now, the tower was one of many bastions along the coast overlooking the sea. Utilizing the monotone color from the lighting to my benefit, I was able to closely recreate the texture on the rocks and apply them to the surrounding geometry to communicate how the structure was cut out of the surrounding landscape. Much of the rest of the map received the same treatment, refining the texture and shape of the blocks to more closely resemble stonework. Red Neutral's tall stone wall became overgrown with foliage, complementing the warm lighting with some cool greens. You can see here how the light shafts dramatically reveal themselves through the seams and trees. Third Neutral evolved into a gazebo, with elegant archways and ornate torches. The symmetrical and tall shape of Blue Neutral made it the perfect candidate for implementing the cathedral. This being an interior space was a good opportunity to introduce a cooler color palette to contrast the warmer outdoor areas. A blue rug with gold trim draped over marble tiles really sold the royal nature of the cathedral. What was previously a dead-end hallway hosting the rocket launcher was now a brightly lit, open-aired altar. I traded in the hard geometry in front of the cathedral for terrain to make way for the graveyard. Both the added gravestones and the crypt next to the cathedral entrance would help nuance the interactions between both neutrals even more. I placed a power-up inside the crypt located in front of the cathedral, and hid it by placing the cover on top. It takes a good 20 to 30 seconds to move the stone out of the way so you can get to the power-up. This is intentionally impractical, and was just for my own amusement. And finally, as I neared the end of this long development process, which took place over the span of 7 months, I wanted to double down on the drama, a cherry on top to complement the already enticing setting. I recruited the help of Extraterrestrial, a peer of mine, to script a lightning strike effect taking place as the player exits the receiving end of the teleporter. To this very day, all of the most memorable moments I've had on this map take place in and around the tower, and here lies the power of designing around compelling set pieces. If you can make them work, it's worth it. At the time of posting this video, Last Bastion will be 2 years old, and while there are many additions I would make to the map to add more depth and charm, there are very few changes that I feel are necessary after hundreds of playtests. For all I've learned and how much I've changed over the past few years, this map continues to hold up against my ever-rising standards and goals. What I'm trying to say is I think it's aged really well. The theatrics of the lightning, intimidating vertical scale, and the rich relationship between the different segments, each with their own character and roleplay. It was everything I wanted it to be, and will continue to be the map I compare the rest of my creations with. That is, until the day I'm finally able to surpass it. I hope you enjoyed this level design documentary and learned something along the way. If so, there will be plenty more to look forward to. I'll see you next time.